The build system in Planet Coaster 2 can feel overwhelming at first. While there's plenty of tutorials and speed builds around, I understand that not everyone has the time, patience, or maybe even the skill to master the advanced techniques needed to create the more intricate stuff. But don't worry, there's some simple tricks even beginners can use to build like a pro. If your creations are looking a little dull, flat, or maybe boxy, and you just want to enhance them a bit without having to sink 50 hours into practice, these 10 simple tips are for you. Let's start with scale. Buildings look more convincing when they're sized proportionately to the guests. I'd say most players have a tendency to oversize things when you're starting out. I've certainly done it myself. You think you've created a cute little shop and it turns out it's the size of a superstore. So first off, a quick way to keep an eye on your scale is to place a stone guest next to the build. They're the same size as real guests, and it makes them a really good reference for quickly checking if your build is feeling oversized. Next, right, this is going to be a mouthful. To get to grips with correct scaling, we do need to briefly go over the different types of objects first, because they're not all the same. And I remember when I first started playing Planet Coaster, I could not get my head around this at all. I watched many tutorials on it and really didn't understand why some pieces would move, others wouldn't. Why can't I rotate them when I can rotate others? I really struggled with this, so I'm going to explain it in the most simple terms that helped me when I finally understood what I was doing with them. There's two main types of objects used for building in the game: build pieces like walls, floors and roofing, which are locked to the grid and they can't be scaled, and scenery pieces, which can be freely moved and resized. The gridlock pieces are intended to make building construction easier for beginner players, but I found they're a little too large in proportion to guests, and since they can't be adjusted in scale, this is why when starting out, if you're mostly relying on build pieces to create a structure, it can end up looking like a big square box. You can quickly identify the gridlock pieces in the menu by the faint grid pattern behind their icon, and when you place these pieces, this has what I like to think of as a protective layer around it, a build group. So as soon as I place this, it's triggered the build group. And an easy way to tell that you're in a build group, it's got this orange border around the screen here. What this means is that whilst I'm in this edit build group mode, every time I click another gridded build piece here, it's going to put it in this build group. And that means all of these pieces, they're locked to the build group of this very first piece that I placed. And if you're happy with the big square box technique of creating a building, then sure, this is an easier way to build. You just click it, you place it, it's no bother, is it? Now I can exit this group, and if I re-click it, it's going to highlight me the whole group. And whilst in this state with all the pieces, I've got complete control. I can move this anywhere I want. Well, I can move it horizontally. Can't rotate it vertically, can't rescale it, anything like that. But it can be advanced moved here whilst I'm not in the editing screen. So that's the build pieces. Scenery pieces, by contrast, allow for more flexibility and enable more realistically scaled designs. Placing a scenery piece doesn't trigger any kind of group, and I've got free flexibility with this to move it anywhere I want, can rotate it, can scale it, can do everything with this piece. And I think what confuses people, well, it did confuse me starting out. Whilst this is on its own, it's fine. As soon as I move it and place it on this building that we created, it asks me if it wants to be part of the building group. And even more confusing, it's calling it a scenery group, even though this is a building group. Yeah, it does get confusing, doesn't it? Right, anyway, so if I click this now on this group, it doesn't place it. It basically opens up the building group editor. And that means this scenery piece is now part of that building group, even though I haven't placed it yet. So if I just click this anywhere, this is now placed. And if I go out of the editor again and try to move this, it moves the scenery piece with it. So now we've lost a little bit of that control with the scenery piece. And if I want to move it onto that building, I need to click into the building piece editor to be able to move it. It also means I have to be in this building group now if I want to change the size or scale of the scenery piece. Now, the good thing with scenery pieces is they don't have to be in the building group. You can create a scenery group with just scenery pieces, and that retains all of that flexibility when you're outside of the group. So put a couple of scenery pieces down, and if I highlight all these, down in the bottom of the tab here, I've got a thing there called Create New Group. Used to be called Create New Scenery Group, so maybe it's me being odd there. Maybe they've changed it from the upgrade from Planet Coaster 1 to 2, and I didn't spot it. Anyway, so create new group with this, and let's group these objects together as a scenery group. In contrast to the group we created before with the build pieces in it, We've still got full control of this when we're not in the editor mode, so I can click this whole thing, it's highlighted all the pieces within this scenery group, and I can still freely rotate this. I can scale it up, scale it down. I've got vertical rotation, and that is the big difference between scenery groups and build groups. Any group you create that doesn't have a build piece in it, so a gridded piece, you've got this flexibility maintained whatever you do with it, and that works much better for making realistic builds that are scaled correctly. As an example, here's a fairly basic Western train station I created using scenery wall panels and roofing. And for comparison, this is the same building but using gridlock pieces. If I overlay the two, now you can see here how the gridded version is slightly wider and boxier in general. Although the decoration and styles are similar, the overall proportions feel far more natural in the scenery piece version because I've been able to manipulate the pieces, make them smaller, make them bigger. I was able to reduce the angle on the roof so it didn't take up as much room, stuff like that, and it just looks better than being stuck with the gridded pieces in this version where I have far less control. I've had to use the sizes that the gridded pieces come by, which is the 4x4, and the angle of the roof, which is far too tall and wide for my liking. So my suggestion with this is, if you want to make buildings more in proportion to the size of the guests and you want to scale it correctly, just avoid the grid pieces if you can. It's very achievable to make something like this entirely out of the scenery pieces. Where you might struggle with something like this, decorating facilities can be tricky as they use the 4x4 square box. To work around this, mix and match, use building pieces to cover the facility with scaled down scenery for the rest. Also, where available, use counter versions of facilities. For these, you can use scenery pieces freely to maintain a smaller, more proportionate scale. Another tricky point with scaled down builds is roofing. Custom roofing is fiddly work, and I totally get that most people don't have the time or patience to create a piece by piece custom roof. Now, a light touch approach to this is using non-gridded roof attachments which can be scaled to fit. Currently, there's only two options for this. We've got the corrugated iron and the wooden tile roof verandas, which were added in the last update. Alternatively, the eaves roof gridded pieces can be used to create shorter roofing. To apply this, when in the building group, set the grid size and height to the lowest setting, and that means the eaves can be placed closely together and you can build up the roof this way, but you can make it shorter to fit the shorter scale of the building. This does only work with the 2 metre and the 4 metre eaves though. The 1 metre version, this is too angled and it creates these little steps when you use it in that way, so it's not feasible really. Now, using both of these methods, yes, you've got a shorter roof, but what that means is these gaps at the side, you can't use the usual slope pieces, like the build pieces, to fill this in, because it's too long now. Instead, what we do to fill this, you use the free build scenery pieces. So, select your scenery piece, and if you've got align with surface turned on, this will automatically set it to the right angle. Then you can just slot it into place with the advanced move. Next tip, we're going to talk about reducing the squareness, if that's a word. When you're producing too many square boxy buildings, that's a problem again with the gridlock pieces. And that's because when you're working with these pieces, they are restricted to right angles when you're within the group. But there are a few ways to work around this. First, as I mentioned in tip 1, using scenery pieces lets you freely rotate and position elements to create more interesting shapes. And that's my preferred method to do this. However, I do understand not everyone's going to be on board with using scenery pieces. You might still want to use the gridded pieces whilst you're still getting your head around the different groups. So if you would prefer to stick with the gridlock pieces for now, what you can do is split the building group up so that when you're not in the editor, you can freely move those two separate groups and merge them together and move the pieces around. And that means you can create more interesting angles because you're working with two groups. But again, if this is not your thing and it's getting too complicated to split the groups up, you can still work within the one group and make it a little more varied by reducing that grid size down. Whack the scales down, and that means you can move these pieces in much smaller increments and little offsets. And with that, you can make small alcoves, which adds a bit of variation, but you're not going to have to deal with having multiple groups and stuff like with the other ways. Any way you do this, buildings that move away from the strict right angles tend to just look more dynamic. As an example, this slush hour shop just created this a couple of weeks ago, and where I've put the offset angles for the window box and the shop windows underneath, it adds so much more variety than a flat square shape, which would look like this. Big difference. Another tip for avoiding the squareness. Now, sometimes you can't get away from using the gridded pieces. And an example here of mine, now I do tend to build exclusively with the scenery wall pieces. Even for the toilets and stuff, I will figure out a way to use scenery pieces for that. But with this build, I really wanted to use the wood bottom wall for the main structure, and there's no equivalent wall as a scenery piece for that one. So it was a case of don't use this wall or deal with the grid piece. Decided to stick with the gridded piece. But to work around the grid locking, I've worked with multiple building groups on this one. Some are stacked on top of each other, we've got some at a diagonal there. Some of them are even just overlapping slightly with each other because the wall needs to be slightly longer or something. So end of the day, stuff like this is achievable using the gridlock pieces, but it's a lot more work and it's a lot more fiddly than you can achieve with using scenery pieces for this sort of thing. Moving on, tip number 3, correcting graphical glitches. There's 2 common visual issues with buildings in Planet Coaster 2, and it was also present in Planet Coaster 1, and it stems from the game engine, not user error, which I wish I'd known starting out. I thought I was doing something wrong. It's just some graphical quirks that are easily fixed. First, when placing flat roofing, you might see the roof colour bleeding through the walls like this. To fix this, move all the pieces separately, rotate them twice, move them back into the original place, and somehow this convinces the game to render the correct surface. The second graphical issue is the Z-fighting. If you don't know what Z-fighting is, don't worry, I didn't know before I played Planet Coaster, and I was oblivious to it for a long time after I was playing too. It's basically what it's called when overlapping pieces flicker due to the game not knowing what surface to display. To fix this, just use the advanced move tool to nudge one of the pieces slightly forward, just enough to stop the flicker without creating a visible gap. Too far and you'll get a seam. Tip number 4, this is the last one about the grid, I promise. If you're working on something with lots of scenery pieces, my advice is to build this on the world grid first, then move it into place. To give you an example of this, so you fill in a curved path with facilities, and your instinct might be to start this build on the curve. So I'll put down a facility here, and we'll add a few scenery pieces. I want to duplicate these pieces to the other side. So if I do the duplicate and advanced move, oh dear, look at that. The arrows for the advanced move are at a very strange angle, and that's because the game averages the rotation of multiple pieces, and it throws off the relative axes. So this is going to be fiddly to move, and it's going to be difficult to align exactly. Try moving just the one piece, and the relative axes is fine. Both pieces, due to the game average and the rotation, it's not. Personally, I find this very frustrating, so to avoid the headache of this, place the facility without rotating it first, and it'll be aligned to the world grid. Build everything at this angle, and when we get to duplicating the scenery pieces, as you can see, yeah, the relative axis is now balked, but I can switch to the world axis, and it's now lined up perfectly. If I was to build this directly on the path like that stuff over there, the world axes would be balked too, so it would take a lot longer to complete. But once I've built this one, I can move this whole building into position on the path. This is much easier, and as I say, it avoids the alignment headaches. Tip number 5 is to do with the duplication of odd angled stuff. That's a bit of a silly name, but I'm not really sure what else you would call it other than it's just odd angled stuff, so let's call it that. So, odd angles. Say you want to create a custom fence to border this path. So I'll just get a few scenery pieces to demonstrate this. Now the normal way to do this would be to select all this and make it into a scenery group. Now we need to duplicate and advance move it to make the next one, and the angle is off because of the average rotation. Now I could persist with this and take a stupid amount of time to put this into place, and believe me, I've done that in the past before I knew about this trick. Instead, a better way with this is to create a building group first using a small gridded piece, then add all the scenery pieces that I want to make this fence within the building group. What that means is that all of these scenery pieces are now locked to the grid of the building group, and as we learned before, that means that they're all locked to the same axes as the gridded piece, so when I duplicate and advance move this, the axes is all now lined up, and it doesn't create that weird angle because it's not taking the average of all the pieces anymore, it's going exclusively off the gridded piece. And that makes repeating patterns like this custom fence much easier to move and align. Once you're done and the fence is all set up, you can also go back into this and delete all those hidden grid pieces underneath to reduce the object count. So on to tip number 6, which is about visualizing pieces. Planet Coaster 2 already has thousands of build pieces with more to come. That's great for variety, but if you're anything like me, this is overwhelming to navigate. Rather than trawling through the tiny menus, I use two methods to speed things up. First is using the favourites function. So for example, I use plaster walls a lot, so I've marked them as favourites. To create a favourite, hover over the item that you want to favourite, and then right click and just press the favourite button. To unfavourite something, it's the same process, but it just says unfavourite. Now apologies if you're a console player, I'm not sure what button needs pressing on this for the console, but the process should be similar. Once this is set up, you can filter the menu to show favourites only, and that cuts down scrolling and helps you find go-to pieces fast. Another method I use to get good oversight of the pieces, I lay everything out that I feel might be useful before starting a build. For these recently completed Main Street blueprints, I pre-selected everything I thought might come in handy, and placed it all out just behind the build area. I can admit this might just be a personal choice for me, but I can visualise pieces I need far quicker than remembering the name of something. Let's just say I want a wood beam for something, but the problem is in Planet Coaster, there's a bunch of wood beam structures with various names, so instead of searching the menu by name and not finding anything because I've forgotten what this one specific beam I want it's called, instead I can just jump over to my pile of objects, I guess you'd call it, and it's easier for me to spot in this pile the object that I need than trawling through the menu to find the name of it. As you can probably tell, this method does need a bit of prep up front, but for me personally, I found it saves loads of time once building is underway. My tip number 7 is about adding texture to buildings to reduce the flatness. Tip number 1 about avoiding oversizing helps with this, but to really make buildings pop, you need detail to break up blank spaces. For example, back to the blueprint of the Mr. Frosty shop here. Elements like the awning and the extra trims, this adds interest and prevents large empty wall areas. And for this, instead of just using the in-game pieces for what they're meant for, keep an eye out for useful pieces with an unintended use. This awning, for example, is a wall sign, and the extra trims on the windows, that's a coaster support scaled way down to like 10%, 15%, something like that. Using two types of texture for the window frame here also adds way more depth than if it was just a single frame. If all that sounds too fiddly though, a simpler trick is setting in-game windows back into the wall rather than placing them flat on top. Using this wall as an example, on one side here I've used a standard wall and surface mounted window. That's super quick to place but also very flat. On the other side I've built the wall with scenery pieces, leaving a gap for the windows. With the gap here I can recess the window into the wall, and while that's just a very small change, it makes a huge difference. Tip 8 is similar to tip 7 but specifically for ride stations. The ride stations are especially prone to looking a bit flat and boxy due to their rectangular grid-based structure. Unlike more flexible builds, breaking up the space here takes a little extra effort. Layering is essential, building on the principles of my tip 7, but you will need to push a bit harder with this, especially when stations are elevated. As an example, this is a cable car station from my Viking park. It's raised well above ground level, and that could easily make it feel like a tall empty box. To avoid that, I've layered the base with a stone foundation, I've added wooden panels and beams for variation, and I've used different materials to break up the height. Another effective trick is to raise the surrounding terrain. This visually grounds the station, making it feel less like a tower. You can also embed rocks or foliage at the base to add depth, and that makes the transition from structure to landscape more natural. So, on to tip 9. Tip 9 is about lighting. With Planet Coaster 2's improved lighting, building interiors can get very dark. That of course is great for dark rides, but it's not ideal for shops or restaurants where you want bright, inviting spaces. While lighting props should solve this, most of the decorative lights in the game, they don't emit much actual light. For example, in this interior, I've added several wall lights, but they barely brighten the space. I've found that the only lights that reliably illuminate interiors are the spotlights. However, I would say that covering an entire ceiling in spotlights, that's going to ruin the aesthetic. My tip, create a false ceiling and hide spotlights above it. This gives you effective lighting without compromising on style. You can then decorate the visible interior with decorative lights. For extra brightness, if you want it super bright in here, you can also hide spotlights under the floor as well. Another way that I use to brighten large interior spaces, add skylights. This train station platform that I've created is much brighter inside thanks to these skylights that I created, and that's just using glass pieces and the custom frame using the tiny coaster supports that I was showing you before. On to tip 10. Tip 10 for new players, I would say don't be afraid to use blueprints. When I was learning to play Planet Coaster, I felt like using blueprints was cheating for some reason, and it's absolutely not. Whether you prefer using in-game blueprints or downloadable ones that other players have created on the Frontier Workshop, blueprints aren't just for placing, they're a great learning tool. I would certainly recommend going to the workshop, taking a look at some blueprints that you're not sure how they built it, but you'd like to know. Load it into your game and study it. And yes, once you're studying it, well, what I'm calling study, you'll be basically just breaking it apart, ripping it up, and having a look what was the technique they used to build it. Most creators are happy for their work to be used in this way. Certainly any of my builds, if you have a look at any of my builds on the workshop, I am 100% okay if all you want to do with it is rip it up and see how I put it together. Blueprints are there to be shared, to be replicated, and help everyone get a bit better at the game. My only caveat with this, don't re-upload someone else's work without meaningful changes. That unfortunately happens more often than you'd think, and it's poor form. If you use a significant part of someone else's work in your own upload, credit them at least in the description. It's simple courtesy and that goes a long way. Anyway, wow, we made it to the end. That's everything I can think of that is a simple but effective way to amplify your builds in Planet Coaster 2 when you're just starting out and don't yet have the knowledge to make an entire cathedral or something. Hope it's been helpful. As always, thanks so much for watching. I'll catch you in the next video.